Naeti ne engasawe nenge uihudoga. Nguayat yei sa hunumenjote ne Gayogohó. Daune weti dwatanu ha. Ne todich ne yochtik ne unguat ni guha. Nguenadene one. It's now I'll start the matters of the day. We are gathering in the lands of the Gayogohó, or the people of the wetlands, and we will acknowledge and greet each other so that it will be this way in our minds. Professor Moreton-Robinson is a Goenpul woman of the Quandamooka Nation of Stradbroke Island, Queensland. She is a distinguished professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Queensland and a founding member of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, where she holds her current position of president-elect. Currently, Professor Moreton-Robinson is a board member of the Indigenous Rights Advocacy Organization and the Foundation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research Action, which is LTD FARA, where her advocacy and intellectual work focus on Indigenous sovereignty. Dr. Moreton-Robinson is most noted for her profound contribution to critical Indigenous studies through her writing, Talking Up the White Woman, which makes visible whiteness and power relations, and her second book, The White Possessive, which explores the interwoven connections between race, sovereignty, possession of property and people, and the construction of Australian nationhood. Today, we would like to welcome Dr. Moreton-Robinson to the Haudenosaunee homelands and recognize her contributions to our Indigenous communities. Not only her academic excellence, but also through her contributions and successes beyond the lens of colonial systems. Through her commitments to truth and authenticity to Indigenous peoples, from Indigenous peoples, and within our ongoing Indigenous kinship systems. It is an honor to have an opportunity to yawn with Dr. Moreton-Robinson. And so now welcome Dr. Moreton-Robinson, and her title of her talk today is Place Names, Monuments, and Cannibalism, James Cook and the Possessive Logics of Patriarchal White Sovereignty.
Well, thank you. Thank you. What a wonderful welcome. And I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples where I am and where you are. I like to thank Professor Rickard for inviting me to participate in this. And I hope that you find the paper interesting. It's still very much a work in progress, but it's been ideas that I've been, I guess, playing with for a while now. And so I'll be interested in question time. All right, so I guess I'll begin. Within modernity, commemorating historical events and personas in public spaces has been through the erection of monuments and statues. In the 20th century, these objects have been targets of political protest. In the second decade of the 21st century, two protest movements, Idle No More and Black Lives Matter, have greatly influenced the questioning of everyday landscapes and the role of official memory in the erection, maintenance, or removal of monuments and memorials. Both movements were initiated and led respectively by Indigenous and Black women. It is estimated that millions of protesters took to the streets protesting state abuse of treaty rights and environmental vandalism, as well as the need for criminal justice reform to end police brutality. Idle No More and Black Lives Matter spread globally as Black and Indigenous people protested in solidarity against state violence. Public protests took different forms. Across the US, statues commemorating military and political leaders involved in slavery and colonisation were defaced and removed. Second slide, please. Okay. Statues of Christopher Columbus were targeted. One was toppled by ropes in Minnesota another beheaded in Boston, and in Richmond, Virginia, his statue was dragged into a pond and thrown into water, symbolically drowning Columbus. Other statues of Winnipero Serrera, Awan Guhanati, and Kit Carson, involved in the mistreatment of Native Americans, were also torn down or removed. Across the Atlantic in Bristol, England, slave trader Ed Colston's statue was thrown into the harbour, and a statue of the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was sprayed with graffiti. In Toronto, Canada, statues of former President MacDonald, King Edward VII of England, and Egerton Ryerson, father of the Indian residential school system, were disfigured. While in Hyde Park, Sydney, Australia, Captain James Cook statue was damaged, as was the statue of Lachlan Macquarie, the first governor of the colony of New South Wales. Statues are at one level iconic representations of a history, and drawing on the work of Michael Taussig, we can understand defacement as an act of unmasking a public secret. Taussig asks, and I quote, "What if the truth is not so much a secret as a public secret, as is the case with most important social knowledge, knowing what not to know? Then what happens to the inspired act of defacement? Does it destroy the secret or further empower it? For are not shared secrets the basis of our social institutions, the workplace, the market, the family, and the state? Is not such public secrecy the most interesting, the most powerful, and the most mischievous and ubiquitous form of socially active knowledge there is?" As socially active knowledge, public secrets are more than knowing what not to know, for they prefer an unknowing in what is known. As the protests illuminate, history is always in the present. We are born into a history not of our making or knowing, and we make history and come to know under those conditions. These conditions shape the way we are oriented towards history through objects that humans consume and impute with meaning, often with repression. In defacing statues, we are unmasking secrets hidden by power. In this paper, I consider how the body of the historical figure, Captain James Cook, is available for consumption through use and commemoration every day in Indigenous lands connected by the Pacific Ocean. This form of cannibalism I define as a discursive form of bodily consumption operating within material culture, which I limit to statues, place names, and monuments for this paper. As I have argued elsewhere, the complex relations between objects and people by which national identity, relationships, and values are expressed do so within an order of things, discursively configured through the possessive logics of patriarchal white sovereignty. As will be illustrated, statues, monuments, and place names tied to James Cook are things imbued with meaning in everyday life. As public secrets, they stand as tangible and intangible evidence of white possession and Indigenous dispossession. Here I use the concept possessive logic to denote a mode of rationalisation rather than a set of propositions or positions producing more or less inevitable answers, underpinned by an excessive desire to invest in reproducing and affirming the nation as a white possession. These racialised and gendered possessive logic circulate sets of meanings and presuppositions as part of vernacular knowledge, decision-making, and socially produced conventions. Slide 3, please. So James Cook looms large in the Australian imaginary as an enduring iconic figure. His name is synonymous with discovering Australia, and his reputation as Britain's greatest seafarer has grown exponentially over the centuries. In Australian popular culture, Cook's face is displayed on water bottles, plates, and other paraphernalia. Slide 4, thanks. A cottage built by Cook's parents in 1755 was purchased and transported to Australia in 1934 by Sir Russell Grimwade, who donated it to the people of Melbourne in commemoration of 100 years of settlement. The cottage remains a popular tourist attraction. As an historical figure identified as opening up the Pacific, several television series have represented and retraced Cook's voyages in the Pacific. In 2018, a 6-part documentary series entitled The Pacific in the Wake of Captain Cook was hosted and narrated by New Zealand actor Sam Neill. In the last part of the series, Neill visits Hawaii. Hawaii is famous for many things, especially its hospitality, and it holds a special place in Indigenous Pacific history as the site where Captain James Cook met his death in 1779. Slide 5, please. Indigenous peoples within the Pacific have varying, different, and complex histories involving Cook. We are connected by the colonial aftermath of Cook's discoveries, but more importantly, our spiritual and ancestral genealogies that link our respective continuing sovereignties and canoe cultures tell us of histories that were and are before Cook. In a recent article in the journal Nature, a study of genomics and population genetics shows that Polynesians interacted with Native Americans around 1200 AD, at least 800 years before Europeans were in the Pacific, or the Americas. These histories challenge manifest destiny and discovery narratives and are of little importance to the disciplinary knowledge produced compared to Cook's death. The anthropological debate between Marshall Salins and Gayogohó, I probably mispronounced that, over how and why Cook was killed is infamous. Their explanations vary from the death being a metaphysically challenged event to one steeped in retribution and pragmatism. They argue between themselves that the natives understood Cook either as a returning god who, in keeping with Hawaiian ritual, should be killed, or as a kidnapper who attempted to take captive and punish a native Hawaiian chief for appropriating one of Cook's small boats. Native Hawaiian scholar Herb Kanoe Kane challenges the idea that Hawaiians perceived Cook as a returning god. Kane argues there's one cultural fact overlooked in these debates. Within Polynesian languages, there is no language equivalent for Western religious terms such as divine, God, adoration, holy, sacrifice, and religion. He notes, and I quote, Cook's men may be excused for their religious vocabulary, but social anthropologists may not be excused for perpetuating it as scientific lexicon. In addition, explaining Cook's death as retribution for his attempt to take a native Hawaiian chief hostage overlooks other contributing factors, such as Cook and his men's complicity in killing several native Hawaiians days before his death, touching the chief's body, which was tapu, forbidden, and the invasive presence of foreign white male bodies on Hawaiian people's land. In anthropological debates, the focus is on Cook's body and explaining how the natives perceive him, not the violation of Hawaiian sovereignty in any form. This focus renders invisible the possessive logics inherent in Cook and his men's sense of entitlement to Hawaiian people's property. They were not invited to be on native Hawaiian soil. Instead, they landed expecting water, food, and pleasure. They appropriated artifacts and they killed native Hawaiians. Anthropologists debating the natives' reasoning to explain Cook's death is in effect a dispute over who is the most knowledgeable about the native. And it is taken for granted that Cook, the white hero, is the victim. In staking a possessive claim to the natives' reasoning, anthropologists reinforce their expertise. The native becomes an epistemological possession of their making, a native who was already known by Cook's crew and now anthropologists. What does this obsession with explaining Hawaiian reasoning and Cook's death tell us about the anthropologists? What is so fascinating about natives killing Cook that continues to be debated within anthropology in the 21st century? Other white men have died at the hands of natives, but their deaths have never received this much attention in anthropology. Metaphorically, Cook's body is consumed by anthropologists in this debate over who knows more about what the natives think. In popular culture, explaining Cook's death features regularly. Often he is represented as a victim of native Hawaiian cannibalism. Like anthropology, the fixation is with Cook's death and what was done to his body. In these accounts, it is inconceivable that Cook had no right to be on Hawaiian land and that he was acting as an agent of British patriarchal white sovereignty. A cursory glance at the World Wide Web is revealing. The following quotes from 4 different websites state, and I quote, "Cook was killed and eaten by Black Hawaiians." 2, it may be the truth that they managed to eat some parts of the captain because the natives were doing the same with the defeated enemies. 3, they roasted and hacked the flesh from his body and, according to some accounts, ate it. 4, it's likely the body was boiled to remove the flesh, but the idea that Hawaiians ate the flesh is in question. Research has shown that the Hawaiian group he and his men fought with didn't practice cannibalism, end of quote. While there is acknowledgement that the native Hawaiians did not practice cannibalism here, there is no explanation provided for boiling and removing flesh, which leaves the reader to imagine what they were doing with Cook's body. The possessive logics at play here do interesting work. In creating a narrative about native Hawaiians as cannibals, white possessiveness creates a thing of its own making, serving the purpose for which it was designed, the recuperation of Cook's virtue, innocence, and of course his victimhood. In this way, native Hawaiians are dispossessed from the ground of moral value, and Cook's complicity in enabling Hawaiian dispossession is rendered invisible. The projection of the cannibal onto the native is an old racist colonizing strategy, demonize to dehumanize. Only native Hawaiians know what happened on that fateful day. Cook's crew were not reliable witnesses, as they did not have a strong command of the language and culture. Cannibalism in modernity has a particular hold on popular imagination as an act of primal social violence, transgressing the core of white social and moral codes. Cook's body is placed as the foci for native Hawaiian desecration and consumption. Narratives about native Hawaiian cannibalism also begs the question of who is being eaten by whom in these virtual contexts. For it is the narrators who cannibalize the embodied ontological existence of native Hawaiians in the service of white superiority and possession. White superiority and possessiveness were embedded in Cook's mission to discover new worlds. These racist attributes were crucial to the spread of the British Empire. As an historical figure, Cook has been portrayed in the West as a man of exemplary deeds, a giant of Pacific exploration, a noble and great navigator, an exceptional man of independent mind and thought, an open-minded seafaring traveller, and importantly, as the discoverer and hero of science and exploration. However, Cook embodied more than these personal and professional attributes afforded to him. As the King of England's representative, Cook embodied patriarchal white sovereignty. in the name of the king, he took possession of Indigenous peoples' lands, resources, and knowledge. Cook's voyages of discovery were consistent with European Enlightenment ideas of colonial expansion, which involved taking possession of the landscape through charting, mapping, and naming, as well as gathering material evidence for their evolving systems of human classification and order. Slide 6, please. Within the colonial imagination, place names play a central role in mapping, for they provide the means of filling ostensibly empty space on maps with meaningful points of interest, signifying ownership and possession. Cook chose to name bays, scapes, and geographical features, usually paying homage to a white patriarchal lineage consisting of lords, earls, scientists, and military men. He used his experiences and imagination to name and claim other sites. By naming the lands and seas in this way, Cook is defining and demarcating the land and seascapes as the exclusive possession of patriarchal white sovereignty. Cook named 49 places in honour of white men and named another 59 places, reflecting his experiences of sea travel and imaginings on his voyage along the east coast of Australia. For example, Cook named a cluster of mountains on the Sunshine Coast where I live in Queensland as the Glasshouse Mountains, because they reminded him of glasshouses in England. These mountains are on my great-great-great-grandmother Naywin's country and are known respectively as Birrarum, Birrawa, Kutchin, Kurawin, Imbala, Nangan, Tirabut, Dargan, and Kui. Further north, he named a place, Thirsty Sound, because he could not find fresh water. Similarly, in naming Cape Tribulation, he wrote, quote, "Here is where our troubles began." On later voyages, as he ventured east to the Pacific, where he named the Sandwich Islands, now known as Hawaii, was in paying homage to the Earl of Sandwich. Cook's charts open the Pacific and enable colonisation by making visible seas and lands that could be crossed and possessed. Byrne and Cairns argue in relation to Cook's journey around New Zealand that, quote, "In the 10 days from the time he made landfall, adjacent to the mouth of the Turanganui River on the 9th of October, 1769, Cook and his men were responsible for the death of at least 7 natives and the serious injury of 5 others. As a result of his experiences, Cook named the place Poverty Bay because, in his own words, quote, "It afforded us no one thing we wanted," end of quote. Cook went on to circumnavigate the islands of New Zealand, providing English names for many prominent coastal features, and in doing so, incorporating New Zealand fully within the rhetorical ambit of a white geohistorical discourse, end of quote. Cook did more than incorporate New Zealand rhetorically into the ambit of a white geohistorical discourse. He embodied and enacted patriarchal white sovereignty in taking possession of the landscape through the process of naming. As the one who names, he was simultaneously placing his bodily presence within the landscape. This discursive signification renders the materiality of the landscape and seas visible for British navigation and maps. Through the act of place naming, Cook's body becomes omnipresent within the landscape, discursively inscribing white possession. An embodiment that does more than haunt the landscape through spectra. For these place names are a constitutive part of the possessive logic of patriarchal white sovereignty in their signification of Cook and his appropriation. Cook's place names evince his body within the landscape, a body which is consumed through an iterative process of signification and use, as well as cartographic and geographical recognition. Cook's body is omnipresent and signified throughout the Pacific Rim by places named in his honour. To name a few, the Cook Islands, a former British protectorate in 1888, Cook Inlet in Alaska, Cook Strait between North and South New Zealand, at slide 7, please, Cooktown on the east coast of Australia, slide 8. Then there is the town of Captain Cook in the state of Hawaii, which was once part of a ranch owned by Englishman Henry Nicholas Greenwell in the mid-1800s. These places exist within nations that bear the mark of various patriarchal white sovereignties, Britain, Russia, and the United States. Within national imaginaries, these places represent commemorative claims of belonging, authority, and meaning that support hegemonic structures of white power. The act of giving Cook's name to a place indelibly marks it as tied to all that he embodies. In this way, the possessive logic of patriarchal white sovereignty informs the place naming. Nation states offer his body for national consumption by naming places also in the landscape in his honour. Cook became a white possession, and that white national identity formation consumes. In the everyday, citizens and tourists consume Cook's terrestrial omnipresence, affording them the sweet taste of comfort and reassurance that the nation is a white possession. This consumption disavows the continuing Indigenous sovereignties and histories that presuppose Cook's existence. However, this disavowal is never really accomplished because Indigenous sovereignties are not configured through the logic of capital. They are grounded in and of the landscape, tied to place through genealogy and story, not an 18th century discourse of discovery. Place names are part of the logics of patriarchal white sovereignty. Nation states appropriate space and the symbolic construction of meanings about place. They are not passive signifiers, as they invite us to consume and partake of national identity. Places bearing Cook's name signify and embody patriarchal white sovereignty within the land and oceans. Place names are not the only signs that enable the consumption of Cook's body within modernity. National cultures conceive of their past, not just through place names. They also produce memorial devices for public consumption. Representations of Cook's body have been sculptured and cast in bronze as public statues. In The Political Lives of Dead Bodies, Catherine Verdi argues that, and I quote, "Statues are dead people cast in bronze or carved in stone. They symbolise a specific famous person, while in a sense also being the body of that person. By arresting the process of that person's bodily decay, a statue alters the temporality associated with the person, bringing him into the realm of the timeless, of the sacred," end of quote. So statues of Cook are spatial and temporal landmarks infused with social memory, serving a didactic consumptive function as signs of discovery, progress, and civility. Monument and statues have the patina of a previous shared era they describe and invoke the space of monumentality as a site of dialogue for contiguity is one of the ways Western societies organise their relationships with things. Public objects such as statues reflect not only personal tastes and attributes, but also the moral principles and social ideals of the nation state that commissioned them. Material things are meaningful and significant in public spaces because they are important in sustaining lives, transforming social relations, and mediating differential interests and values, providing essential tools for thought. Public statues are often conduits for the expression and self-realisation of national, group, and individual identities. They provide discursive and non-discursive modes of communication through codes of recognition and commemoration culturally embedded in the possessive logics of patriarchal white sovereignty. Since the 19th century, public statues represent symbols of a nation's security as expression of a nation's self-concept and as signs of one's connection to or differentiation from other nations. As Sarah Hamed argues, subjects are oriented towards and anchored by national objects. As public possessions, these objects imbue different and multiple forms of meaning that can be allegorical as well as literal. Statues of Cook commemorate a specific historical figure from a specific historical moment. They denote a past and a present and implicate their connection within continuity as change and permanence, possession and ownership, the unknowable and the known. Statues of Cook portray being contiguous to patriarchal white sovereignty as an embodiment of its imperial reach and adaptability to new environments and the fulfillment of its desire to possess them. Statues of Cook are more than historical monuments. They are monuments to imperial history. Slide 9, please. As such, they do discursive work, constructing the category of history through the possessive logic of patriarchal white sovereignty, to self-privilege the existence of the colonizer and their descendants, a particular conceptualization of history as the actuations of great white men transcending time and space. With such a conceptualization, statues of Cook, resplendent in bronze and stone, must continually perpetuate the consumption and affirmation of white possession to repress the embodied Indigenous sovereignties that refuse its existence. Thus, monuments dedicated to Cook are not merely aesthetic representations. They are available for consumption, often bringing to consciousness people and things as eternal memories. As the embodiment of patriarchal white sovereignty, they evoke social memory as a shared history that shapes white subjects' perceptions of themselves. Cook's body signifies discovery, origins, heroism, and in his place in history as an enduring icon, and it is almost infinite. In the construction of national identity, nation states develop historical narratives to provide continuity through identity. Statues of Cook do discursive work as constant reminders of a superior white identity. They serve to remind us that he made the Pacific available for European colonization. Statues of Cook pose his body as forever looking at the horizon. His gaze looks beyond its location. As an imperial leader, Cook's statues inscribe Britain as being a powerful patriarchal white empire that had the technology and navy to take possession of Indigenous lands. Following Cook, the French, Spanish, the German, the Dutch, and the Americans came into the Pacific to take possession of Indigenous lands. As Jody Bird so eloquently states, and I quote, "He is not usually considered to be tied to a particularly American project of imperialism. His voyages began as prelude to the Declaration of Independence, and his death heralded a world transformation in which Indians, savages, land and possession would figure across Atlantic and Pacific worlds and constrain and figure how race, colonialism and imperialism became the primary distinguishing features of settler imperialisms born out of and invested in multicultural liberal democracy," end of quote. The spread of the British Empire is also reinscribed in the present by the statues at Waimea in Hawaii, slide 10, Anchorage in Alaska, slide 11, Victoria in Canada, slide 12, and in St Kilda, Melbourne, Australia, slide 13. All are replicas of Cook's statue in Whitby, England, slide 14. So Cook's statues reflect a serious divide between Indigenous and white settlers, because as white possessions, they exist fundamentally for white consumption while reinscribing patriarchal white sovereignties. However, as much as monumental forms seek to dominate national memory and inscribe patriarchal white sovereignty with their permanence, they are also sites of counter discourses. The 27-foot-high obelisk erected in memory of Cook at Cayuga does different discursive work from other memorials, slide 15. Commissioned by Princess Laikilaki, the obelisk was built in 1874 on land bequeathed to the British Consul General in Hawaii. The British Navy and currently the British Embassy in Washington continue to pay a caretaker to maintain it. The inscription on the obelisk states, quote, "In memory of the great circumnavigator, Captain James Cook, RN, who discovered these islands on the 18th of January, 1778, and fell near this spot on the 14th of February, 1779. End of quote. Nearby, just beneath the surface of the water, is a bronze tablet with the inscription, quote, "Near this spot, Captain James Cook, RN, met his death, February 14th, 1779, end of quote. These two memorials, one on land and the other often submerged underwater, commemorate Cook in different ways. As public secrets, they signify something that everyone in general knows but does not openly discuss. The relational power of the monuments is the effective force of the unspoken knowledge that lends tacit support to the judgments and values that generated the need for silence in the first place. The word fell, inscribed on the land obelisk, in the British vernacular, means to die in battle, and it positions Cook as a warrior and hero. The second intermittently underwater monument does not say Cook was fallen. Instead, he met his death. The use of the word met implies he unexpectedly died at the hands of someone. The white possessive logics at play within the British tribute pays homage to Cook as the embodiment of patriarchal white sovereignty and the fallen hero. While the small underwater monument that speaks the truth about his death and the Hawaiian warriors who killed Cook. Recuperating Cook's virtue absolves patriarchal white sovereignty of any culpability in the death, despite his imperial mission and entitlement to assert a proprietary right on Hawaiian land in taking possession of a chief. A possessive act which would be reproduced over 100 years later by the sons of white American missionaries who held the Hawaiian queen a prisoner while they appropriated the Hawaiian kingdom in the name of American patriarchal white sovereignty. Cook's body is omnipresent and revered at this site. The obelisk is a shrine maintained by Britain, a symbolic grave for the seafaring hero who gave his life for king and country. Tourists who visit the site can only do so via boat tour, kayak, or hiking. The difficulty in access means the site must hold significance to warrant the journey. At this site, tourists partake of Cook's body, consuming its reverence through relations of effect. However, Cook is not the only omnipresent, as the conflict that monuments seek to settle do not end when they come into existence. The mnemonic site is where struggles between white possession and Hawaiian sovereignty are remembered. The obelisk, in commemorating Cook's death, simultaneously memorializes the Hawaiian warriors who defended their chief and the lands and seas to which they are ontologically and genealogically related. The ongoing struggle between Hawaiian sovereignty and patriarchal white sovereignty is monumentalized. Slide 16, please. Cook's body is about, in concluding, Cook's body is available for consumption as the embodiment of discovery and empire, a mode of consumption within a state of perpetual war as politics by other means, which nourishes ongoing signification through commemorative and everyday acts of patriarchal white sovereignty that configures its ownership through the logic of capital. To fulfill patriarchal white sovereignty's continuing quest to belong in Indigenous lands and oceans, from which it is ontologically disconnected, requires the perpetual consumption of Cook's body. This form of cannibalism was not practiced nor invented by Indigenous peoples. Its origins lie within the possessive logics of patriarchal white sovereignty and capitalism. Colonisers have built monuments and statues in the lands of Indigenous peoples they have dispossessed. These statues are also mute expressions of what it means to be the white master. The defacement of statues and monuments by Idle No More and Black Lives Matter protesters is a reminder that there is no waning of history and historical consciousness. Instead, these protests are a defiant truth that speaks to the master on unceded lands where Indigenous sovereignty continues and the slaves are also now free. Thank you.